A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Have you ever noticed how a baby's cry is specifically tuned to be the most impossible sound to ignore? It is like nature designed a biological car alarm that you can't just walk away from. It triggers this immediate visceral response in your chest where your heart rate spikes and you feel this overwhelming urge to make it stop. It is not just annoying, it is physically demanding.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are describing the biological reality of the acoustic properties of an infant's distress signal. There is actually significant research showing that the frequency range of a human infant's cry, typically peaking between 2,000 and 4,000 Hz, overlaps exactly with the most sensitive part of the human hearing spectrum. It is essentially an evolutionary hack to ensure the primary caregiver doesn't just tune it out. If it were a pleasant sound, we might finish our coffee before checking on them. Evolution decided that was a risk the species couldn't take.
It definitely works. But the problem is that when you are in the middle of it, that physiological response can cloud your judgment. You move from being a rational adult to being a frantic mess in about 4 seconds flat. Today's prompt from Daniel in Jerusalem is about exactly that. The analytical breakdown of infant fussing. He wants us to look at the common causes and, more importantly, how to distinguish between a baby just having a rough afternoon and a situation that actually requires a call to the doctor. We are moving from instinctive panic to data-driven assessment.
This is such a critical topic because for new parents, every cry can feel like an emergency. But if we look at it through a technical lens, crying is just the only high-bandwidth communication tool an infant has. They are essentially sending out a generic error code, and as parents, our job is to debug the system. We have to move past the emotional noise and look at the telemetry.
I like that framing. The cry is the error code, but the logs are missing. So, where do we start? Because it feels like there is a huge spectrum between I'm a little bit bored and something is seriously wrong.
The best place to start is by acknowledging the crying paradox. The signal is designed to be stressful so you will act, but the stress of the signal can make it harder to act effectively. To get around that, we need a data-driven assessment framework. The gold standard for understanding normal, healthy fussing is often called the period of purple crying.
That is an acronym, right? I remember reading about this when my nephew was born. It is less about the color of the baby and more about the characteristics of this specific developmental phase.
That is correct. PURPLE. It stands for peak of crying, unexpected, resist soothing, pain-like face, long-lasting, and evening. The most important part for parents to understand is the peak. Most infants hit a peak of fussiness right around 6 to 8 weeks of age. It can be intense, sometimes lasting several hours a day, but it usually starts to taper off significantly by the time they hit 3 or 4 months.
So if you're at that 6-week mark and you feel like you are losing your mind because the baby is screaming for no apparent reason, that is actually the most normal thing in the world. It is a feature of the development, not a bug in your parenting. But why the evening? The witching hour is a real thing, isn't it? My sister used to call it the 5 p.m. meltdown.
It is very real. From a physiological standpoint, think about the sensory load an infant's brain is processing. Their nervous system is incredibly immature. By the time 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening rolls around, they have had 12 hours of lights, sounds, smells, and social interaction. Their ability to regulate their own nervous system just hits a wall. They are overstimulated, and the only way their body knows how to discharge that energy is through vocalization. It is a neurological discharge.
It's like a browser that has had too many tabs open all day and finally just freezes up. You have to restart the system. But before we assume it's just overstimulation, we usually run through the basic triage. I know a lot of parents use the HALT mnemonic to check the basics.
Hungry, angry or anxious, lonely, tired. It is a classic for a reason. Hunger is the most common false positive. Parents often think every cry means the baby needs to eat, which can lead to overfeeding. If a baby is overfed, they get gassy, which leads to more crying, and then the parent offers more milk, and you end up in this feedback loop of digestive discomfort. You have to look for actual hunger cues, like rooting or sucking on hands, rather than just using the bottle as a universal silencer.
Right? And then you're treating a symptom with the thing that caused it. What about the lonely part of that acronym? That feels like it gets dismissed sometimes because people are worried about spoiling the baby. I hear that all the time from the older generation.
The idea of spoiling an infant under 6 months old is a complete myth. At that age, their brain doesn't have the cognitive architecture for manipulation. If they are crying because they want to be held, it is because their nervous system requires the co-regulation of a caregiver's heartbeat, warmth, and breathing to feel safe. It is a biological need for proximity, not a behavioral demand for attention. We call it the fourth trimester for a reason. They aren't fully ready for the external world yet.
So if the basic needs are met, they are fed, clean, and being held, and they are still fussing, that is when we start looking at those deeper developmental shifts. We have talked before about how rapidly their brains change. I think it was back in episode 498 where we discussed the science of the 7-month mark and how cognitive leaps can trigger fussiness. When the brain is rewiring itself to understand things like object permanence or cause and effect, it creates a lot of internal friction.
It's a massive amount of cognitive load. Imagine if you woke up tomorrow and suddenly you could see a new color or hear a frequency you'd never heard before. You would be pretty irritable too. These leaps happen at predictable intervals. If a baby who is usually chill suddenly becomes a Velcro baby who cries the moment you put them down, you are likely looking at a developmental transition rather than a physical ailment. Their world is expanding, and that is terrifying.
Okay, so we have established the normal stuff. The witching hour, the 6-week peak, the developmental leaps. But here is the part that keeps parents up at night. How do you know when it is not normal? When do you stop the soothing and start the car to go to the emergency room? Because the line between fussy and sick can feel very blurry when you're exhausted.
This is where we move from developmental biology into clinical red flags. The first and most objective metric is temperature. For an infant under 3 months old, a rectal temperature of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or higher is an automatic, non-negotiable medical escalation. No exceptions.
Why rectal specifically? I know some parents find that intimidating and prefer the forehead scanners or the ear thermometers because they seem less invasive.
Because in small infants, those external methods are notoriously inaccurate. They can be off by a degree or more in either direction depending on ambient room temperature or skin moisture. At that age, the difference between 99 degrees and 100.4 is the difference between wait and see and a full sepsis workup in the hospital. Their immune systems are so new that they can't fight off infections the way we do, so doctors treat any fever in a neonate with extreme seriousness. It is better to be accurate and uncomfortable for 10 seconds than to miss a brewing infection.
That makes sense. Accuracy matters when the stakes are that high. What about the cry itself? Because I've heard parents say, he just sounds different today. Is there a technical basis for the pain cry versus the I'm annoyed cry?
There absolutely is. A typical fussing cry has a rising and falling cadence. It sounds like a conversation that is just very loud. A pain cry, or a neurological distress cry, is often described as high-pitched, piercing, and continuous. It has a different frequency profile, often much higher than that 4,000 Hz range we mentioned earlier. If you hear a sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, and it doesn't resolve with the usual soothing, that is a data point you shouldn't ignore.
It's that parental intuition, but backed by acoustic reality. What are some of the hidden physical causes that might look like general fussing but are actually medical issues? I've heard of some really strange ones that parents should look for.
One that often gets missed is a hair tourniquet. It sounds minor, but it can be a real emergency. A single strand of a parent's hair or a loose thread from a sock gets wrapped around a baby's toe or finger or other appendages. Because the skin is so soft and the circulation is so delicate, the hair can cut off blood flow very quickly. If a baby is inconsolable, you should always strip them down to the skin and check every single digit for swelling or redness. It is a simple physical check that can solve a major crisis.
That is a great specific tip. It's one of those things you would never think of unless someone told you. What about things like a hidden hernia or an ear infection? How do those present in a baby who can't tell you where it hurts?
Ear infections usually come with other symptoms like a runny nose or a cough, but not always. A key diagnostic sign for an ear infection is if a baby cries harder the moment you lay them flat. The pressure in the middle ear increases when they are horizontal, which causes sharp pain. If they are fine while being held upright but scream the second they hit the crib mattress, check the ears. As for a hernia, you would look for a bulge in the groin or abdominal area that becomes more prominent when they cry or strain.
So the cry itself is the signal, but the physical exam you do at home is the diagnostic step. Now, let's talk about the parent side of this. We mentioned the cognitive load of crisis earlier. When you've been listening to a baby scream for 2 hours, your brain starts to shut down. We did a deep dive on medical emergencies in episode 863, but the psychological aspect of staying calm while a baby is fussing is its own challenge.
It is incredibly difficult. When you are in that state of high cortisol, you lose your ability to problem solve. You forget to check the toes for hair tourniquets. You forget to check the temperature. This is where the 5-minute rule comes in. If the baby is in a safe place, like their crib, and you feel yourself reaching a breaking point, you have to step away.
It feels counterintuitive to walk away from a crying baby, but if your own nervous system is fried, you aren't helping them. You are just reflecting their stress back at them.
You are exactly right. Infants have what we call mirror neurons. They pick up on the heart rate and muscle tension of the person holding them. If you are tense and angry, the baby senses that as a threat in the environment, which makes them cry more. It is a vicious cycle. Taking 5 minutes to breathe, drink some water, and reset your own brain is actually a medical necessity for the safety of the child. It prevents the loss of control that leads to tragic outcomes like shaken baby syndrome, which we discussed in the context of infant safety in that episode 863.
And that is a hard thing for a lot of people to accept, especially if they are feeling the pressure to be the perfect parent. But safe handling is the priority. If you are frustrated, you are more likely to be clumsy or, in extreme cases, lose control. Stepping away is the responsible choice. It is about maintaining the integrity of the caregiver.
It really is. Now let's move into some practical takeaways for the debugging process. One of the most effective things a parent can do is keep a fussing log for 48 hours.
A log? Like literally writing down every time they cry? That sounds like a lot of work when you are already tired and barely have time to brush your teeth.
It sounds tedious, but humans are terrible at estimating time when they are stressed. You might feel like the baby cried all day, but when you look at the log, you see it was actually 3 distinct 20-minute segments that coincided with the end of a nap cycle. That data is gold when you call the pediatrician. Instead of saying he is always fussing, you can say he is fussing specifically between 4 and 6 p.m. and seems to have a lot of abdominal tension. That allows the doctor to rule out things like reflux or milk protein allergies much faster.
That makes the doctor's job so much easier. You're giving them a clear data set to work with rather than just a vague sense of dread. What about the trust your gut factor? We're talking about data and logs, but sometimes a parent just knows something is off.
I will always defend the gut feeling as a valid clinical observation. A primary caregiver spends more time looking at that specific infant than any doctor ever will. You are the world's leading expert on your own baby's baseline. If the cry sounds wrong to you, or if their level of lethargy seems out of character, meaning they are too tired to even cry or eat, that is enough of a reason to call the nurse line. Even if it turns out to be nothing, the cost of a phone call is much lower than the cost of missing an early sign of illness.
That is a great point. The medical system is there to be used. You aren't bothering the doctor by asking for clarification on a symptom. That is literally what they are there for. And most pediatric offices have a 24-hour nurse line for exactly this reason.
And we should mention the fever threshold again in the context of older babies. As they get older, the rules change a bit. We covered a lot of this in episode 522, which was our survival guide for parenting through a fever. Once a baby is over 6 months old, a fever isn't always an emergency in the same way it is for a newborn, provided they are still hydrated and acting relatively normal between bouts of fussing. But for those first 12 weeks, the rules are strict.
Right. Because at that point, the immune system is starting to do its job. It's training. But for the little ones, the neonates, you don't take chances. What about the role of sensory input as a soothing technique? Sometimes we overcomplicate it with fancy swings and expensive gadgets.
Often, less is more. If a baby is fussing because of that evening overstimulation, adding more soothing, like loud toys or bright lights, is just adding more fuel to the fire. Low light white noise that mimics the sound of blood rushing through the placenta and rhythmic motion are the keys. There is a reason the shush sound works. It is a low frequency, consistent noise that helps the infant's brain filter out other stimuli. It's like a noise-canceling headphone for their nervous system.
It's amazing how much of this comes down to basic physics and biology. You're trying to recreate the environment of the womb, because that was the last time their system was perfectly regulated. It was dark, loud, and cramped.
That is the fourth trimester theory in a nutshell. We are basically trying to bridge the gap between the internal world and the external world while their brain catches up. If you can provide that sensory bridge, you can often lower the intensity of the fussing.
So, to recap the triage for Daniel and everyone else, check the basics with HALT. Check for physical triggers like hair tourniquets, wet diapers, or clothing that is too tight. Look for the clinical red flags like a fever of 100.4 or a high-pitched, piercing cry. And if all of those are clear, recognize it might just be the witching hour or a developmental leap.
And don't forget to regulate yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup, and you certainly can't soothe a baby with a frazzled nervous system. If you are in Jerusalem like Daniel, or anywhere else in the world, the biological rules of infancy remain the same. It is a universal language, even if it is a loud and stressful one.
It is a phase, even if it feels like an eternity when you are in the middle of it. I think the most important takeaway is that fussing is a form of engagement. It's the baby trying to figure out how to exist in a very loud, very bright world. They aren't doing it to you. They're going through it with you.
It is. And as they get older, that fussing turns into pointing, then into words, and eventually into prompts for podcasts. It is all part of the same continuum of communication. The error codes just get more sophisticated as the hardware matures.
Well, hopefully this gives Daniel and all the other parents out there a bit of a framework to work with. It is about moving from panic to a structured assessment. It doesn't make the crying any quieter, but it makes it much more manageable.
If you can manage the data, you can manage the stress. There is so much fascinating science hidden in those high-pitched frequencies, even if they are hard to appreciate at 3 o'clock in the morning.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap this one up. We've covered the biology, the clinical red flags, and the practical steps for staying sane.
It has been a pleasure diving into the why behind the noise.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes.
And a big thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We couldn't do these deep dives without their support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you found this breakdown helpful, or if you have your own weirdly effective soothing technique that worked for your baby, we would love to hear about it. Maybe you have a specific song or a specific way of bouncing that seems to work like magic.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the show. We have all the episodes we mentioned today linked in the show notes.
We will be back next time with another deep dive into whatever Daniel or the rest of you throw our way.
Until then, keep debugging those error codes and remember to breathe.
See ya. Ya.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth